Well, welcome, Scott, back to the church lobby. It's good to have you here.
Well, thanks, Karl. Good to see you and good to be with you and your people.
Thank you. Yeah, you were on for the special series we did on desizing the church. Had so
Yep.
many comments on that interview with you, and then you were so kind to write several pieces for your Substack about desizing the church, and I really, really appreciated that.
The people are people are looking for something fresh and new in the church, and people are getting disaffected with certain trends. And I think you've tapped a loud note on
Mm.
one of the most significant disaffections that are going on right now. So I'm
Oh,
grateful
thank you.
for
Yeah,
that
as have
study.
you. Not bad for a couple old guys. We're
You know,
looking at it and
I
saying, "Hey."
I tell people that when you publish a book, you put it out in the water, and some of them float and some of them don't. That's
Yeah. And
what
they do
happens.
take on a life of their own. And all of a sudden, in some ways, it doesn't feel like your property anymore because now people can do
Yeah,
things with it that,
yeah.
whether you like it or not, that's just the way it is. But so in this conversation, we're talking about your newest book, Invisible Jesus, a book about leaving the church and looking for Christ that you co-wrote with Tommy Preson Phillips. And I have had a chance to read the book and really enjoyed it. So I want to jump right into the content because there's a lot and we could spend way more time than we have on it. So
Yeah,
I want to get
yeah,
right into the first of all, could you help by defining deconstruction for us? Because it's a term
yeah.
that has come out recently within the last few years. And I think sometimes we assume that people know what that means, and sometimes people define it differently. How do you define it?
Oh, yeah. And there are lots of definitions. And I griped for a long time about my own students who were using the word deconstruction. I said, that's not what it means. But when you require that people read Jacques Derrida or Foucault and the classic French deconstructionists, you're asking for too much. And the philosophers were sort of looking for the unraveling of current systems and structures that all are really all about propping up power. But the the evangelical world has acclimated itself, or I could say has colonized this term for themselves, to describe people who are disaffected with certain dimensions of the faith or their churches, and usually it's the latter, and looking for something that they think would be, and I don't think it's right to say more satisfying because it's not that sort of sentiment. Rather, they're looking for a church that fits, let's say, the vision of the kingdom that Jesus offers in the Gospels. They're looking for a vision of the church that is more like the early churches, house churches in Paul's ministries, rather than things that they've experienced. Now, some of it has to do with faith, of course, and things that are believed or required to be believed that they have big questions about. But by and large, it is sort of a purifying of the faith and eliminating those dimensions of the faith that are neither central nor even biblically substantiated.
Yeah, you've that was the thing that I appreciated about the book when I first picked it up is you're not deconstructing deconstruction. You're not
Yeah,
just
that's
saying,
right.
well, in fact, I had a conversation not long ago with another pastor who said, I'm really just sick of everybody talking about deconstruction. It's really just old fashioned backsliding. Why don't we call it what it is? And
Yeah.
you're seeing that not only is it not that, but in some ways it's kind of the opposite of that, isn't it?
I think so. Now, here's the thing. I think that there are people who are, backsliding. That's a good old term for
Yeah.
people our age.
Yeah,
Um,
exactly.
yes, but people who are just looking for excuses to leave the faith. Matt Chandler is famous for having said deconstruction is sexy. Well, we didn't like that because we have dealt with far too many whose idea of deconstruction is not backsliding, but um, disappointment with
Mm.
the inconsistencies of the church when compared with the gospel itself, with the New Testament. So it can't be reduced to that. There are some of those, but what we were privileged to see was a study done by the publisher where they examined people using the word deconstruction for themselves and discovered that the vast majority, I think, is the language that we were told, use this to the vast majority are leaving their current church, but they're going to a different one.
Yeah.
So they weren't even, in a sense, they were looking for Jesus. And this is what Tommy and I have both experienced with so many people. And Tommy is right in touch with all these people. He's in the music ministries, music industry. He travels. He has tours, I think, every summer in Germany. He's a big name in Germany. Um, we have encountered so many people who, in a sense, are leaving the nonsense of their local church because of their commitment to Jesus, and they are finding that commitment realized in more organic house churches, smaller churches, rather than mega churches at times. So no, it's not sexy and it's not backsliding. At least that's not the group we're looking at.
Yeah, yeah, I think it's important to make that distinction because obviously, the work that's been done, a lot by Ryan Burge in the Great Dechurching and so on, shows that there is a departure from the church in general that is significant and massive right now. But you're not talking about the departure entirely. You're talking about a subsection of it, as you said earlier, the people who would use a term like deconstructing. When you talk about that specific group, you're talking about people who are doing it very thoughtfully. Uh, Deconstructing is not laziness. Deconstructing is hard work. So it's
Yeah,
not just people who are absent. It's absent for very specific reasons that are encapsulated by that term.
I was sitting one time at a table, and three women pastors were at this table. Now they weren't all senior pastors, but they all said, I'm going through a phase of deconstruction right now.
Hmm.
Now, all three of those women are pastors in churches today, never left the church, but they were purging themselves and the people around them and the influence that they had in their churches from stuff that just didn't fit with where people are today in their Christian faith and didn't fit with the gospel of Jesus. And all three of them were talking about the kingdom of God, which excited me because that's an area of interest to me. So,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah. I as I was reading the book and walking through some of the definitions, I got to a point where I thought, you know what? I I went through a season of deconstruction that at the time I didn't realize was because I ended up where I started. It reminded me later I read C.S. Lewis and G.K. Chesterton, who went through the same thing. They deconstructed
Mm,
the faith of their childhood and ended up coming back home to the faith of their childhood, and not just to
hmm
the faith, but even to the traditions of their childhood. And that
hmm
happened for me as well. While in ministry, a good 20 years or so ago, I spent some serious time reading the postmodernists that you mentioned, Derrida and Foucault and so on, and reading the new atheists. And I'm like, if my faith is strong enough, it should be able to handle all of these serious arguments. But when you
hmm
read those serious arguments, and for me, it was for the first time, third generation pastor, almost everything I'd read had been Christian based. I started thinking through, and I guess I have to ask myself these serious questions that are being posed by these folks. And it
hmm
was Jesus who brought me back, and which is where you go in the book, which I was so, well, I want to get into that in a little bit, that we're talking about the person of Jesus and the fact of the resurrection as the absolute focal point upon which all of this rests. And it was when I re-established myself as an understanding of who Jesus was, what he did, and how central he was in my life that I realized I feel most comfortable worshiping Jesus within the tradition of my upbringing that I am grateful was done with very little hypocrisy and with great integrity. So I could come back to it. But a lot of people who are deconstructing as they're trying to find Jesus, as I did, often end up in a different tradition. Why is a shift of Christian tradition happening within deconstruction so often?
That was my story is I went through a phase of deconstruction out of college. I was rejecting fundamentalism, conservative Baptist type stuff, that was far more concerned about whether you went to a movie than if you cared for the poor. So I think I could say that, and that's not even an exaggeration or hyperbole.
Yeah.
That was very much the case. And I remember I was a first and second year student in seminary when a friend of mine asked me what I believed, because he was a college friend of mine. And I gave him I typed out a one-page thing, and he said, Scott, you've told me what you don't believe. What do you believe?
Wow.
And it was really good phase for me. But I knew at that time, and here I am, loving the Bible, loving study, learning about Jesus, realizing that I knew far more about what I didn't believe than what I did believe. And in a sense, I reconstructed my Christian faith without ever having left the church. But I'm not comfortable. I can't imagine a time when I ever would be comfortable in the kind of church tradition that I grew up in. I just think it's too restrictive, et cetera. So now, Karl, I forgot what your question was.
Yeah. Why is it you have
Oh,
begun to answer it and maybe have answered it entirely? Why do so many who deconstruct end up going to a different Christian tradition than the one that we're raised in?
We know that most people choose a church. Well, Brian Berge has said this. I don't like this one, and I'm not going there. He says most people choose their church because of their politics. The politics is more important than the church faith. But in the other book that came out in conjunction with what you wrote and what we've written, one of the authors' last name is Davis.
Yeah, Jim Davis.
Is yours the great dechurching?
Theirs is the great dechurching. Mine is desizing the church. They both have a yellow and white cover. They sound the same. They look the same. They're talking about the same stuff. Yeah. And neither one of us knew what the other was doing.
Yeah. And yours is all about the church growth movement. And theirs is statistics type stuff.
Very much.
But people choose churches because of friends. So there's going to be one reason these people find a different church is because they have found groups that they belong to that fit with who they are. But what we have learned is that they are looking for a church that is more consistent with what I would call the kingdom gospel, and what they would often say a robust gospel, a robust vision of Jesus that is not simply trying to get people saved and then going to a Bible study every Thursday night at someone's home, but is more engaged, is more practical, is more engaged in the community, cares about justice and the poor. All these things are factoring in to the new groups to which they go. And there's more things than that. I mean, some of them are because of evolution. They're scientists and they can't go to a church that's going to degrade the scientific profession all the time.
I had a conversation several years ago. I was teaching through Genesis, and I got to the Tower of Babel story, and I walked through it and I said, now, if you go to the chapter right before the Tower of Babel story, there are 3 or 4 verses in that chapter that say, and these people then spread out through the region and they develop their own languages and their own tribes and so on. And then you get to Babel. I said, if you start with the Tower of Babel for how language developed, you're going to see something that is completely at odds with what we know anthropologically and sociologically how language developed. Read the chapter before it first, which says they went out to their individual tribes, their individual places, and they developed their own languages. So the Tower of Babel is talking about something else entirely. And I didn't know, I had a visiting professor in the church that day who said, I walked in and I thought, oh, I saw the chapter and went, really? He's going to do Tower of Babel. And when I finished it, she came to me and she said, you have restored my confidence in being able to read the Bible as a valid work of history as well as faith, because you pointed out to me that that's not really where the Bible tells us how all I needed to do was read the chapter before. Why isn't anybody doing this? And I didn't make it up. I'm reading the verses in the chapter before the Tower of Babel. It's all there. But so I think a lot of it is people are looking at that and going, there's a mismatch here. You, in fact, cite Russell Moore, who says that people used to leave because they said they couldn't believe in the supernatural, they couldn't follow the church's strict sexual codes, but that's not the main thing they're saying now. What is it that they're saying now for the reasons they're leaving?
Well, we our editor, we're going to take credit for this, but it was our editor who actually made the suggestion that our book, in some ways, is the exit interview that churches never gave.
Yeah, I can see
And
that.
of course, we haven't conducted any kind of formal exit interview of people who've left a church, but our focus is that these people fundamentally are looking for a Jesus-centered church, a Jesus-centered faith or community that reads the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, that looks at that idea of the kingdom, that looks at the center of Jesus, that looks at his Sermon on the Mount, looks at discipleship, looks at Jesus's care for the poor, Jesus' inclusion of people, his kindness to everybody, his willingness to speak out against the powers, his willingness to take risks, his willingness to go to Jerusalem and denounce the priests and the Pharisees and the scribes and utter strong words to people in power. So his prophetic voice, there's a lot of people who would like to see the church restore its prophetic voice, but not by joining a political party. See, this is another one of the issues, isn't it? Not by joining a political party, but by casting the political party over against the vision of Jesus.
Yeah, you make a point that a big part of the reason for the deconstruction is the loss of confidence in clergy. In 1985, you quote that 67% of the population said they had a high trust in clergy, and it's down to 36%. It's cut almost in half by 2021, and it may be down to half by now as we're having this conversation. So it was just not that long ago. We're talking with obviously within both of our lifetimes that clergy were among the most trusted institutions, and now we're about in the mix with politicians, and maybe that's because we've mixed our message so much with political partisanship. And I think a lot of deconstructors don't see a big difference between the institution of clergy and this institution of politicians.
Oh, I've spent 5, 6 years listening to people tell stories about pastors, Karl,
Yeah.
and the abuse of power, abuse of sexuality, abuse of physical power. So this is a major issue. I mean, and the stories in the newspapers from the Roman Catholic Church to the Southern Baptists to megachurch pastors have really hit the young generation big. My sons and my daughters, my son and my daughter and their spouses do not know a church when the pastors basically weren't getting themselves in trouble. Now, they may not have found out about it till their 30s, but they realized these things were going on during their life. I remember when my daughter was in high school that a local youth pastor was engaged with a couple of the young women in the youth group physically and sexually. He spent time in prison. These stories are out there, and it has degraded and eroded people's confidence in pastors and in the church. And Tommy and I have met lots of people who say, I don't care. I don't care if we ever have a pastor. I just want to trust the people that I'm in fellowship with.
Yeah.
And if they're all untrained, I'm okay with that because I trust them. Now, right there is that is what I would call the prophetic voice of deconstruction. Right there. They're saying something that we need to hear.
A call back to integrity. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Even if they're not practicing it themselves, they have the understanding that those who are professing to be representatives of Christ should be speaking with greater integrity than we're typically speaking with.
That's right.
The way near the end, second, third, or fourth from the last page of your book, Invisible Jesus, you had 3 words, and I thought that's the summation of the you summed your entire book up in 3 words. I don't even know if you realize it. And I read it. Page 199, you wrote, hypocrisy sparks deconstruction.
Yeah.
That to me
Yeah.
is the whole thing right there. 3 words, as concise as it can be.
Well, that's the truth. I mean, it's sad. It's so sad. I mean, um, when I am asked questions, how can I, what tools do I use to help me understand whether I can trust this pastor of a new community where I've moved?
Mhm.
You know, Karl, I think 40 years ago, no one asked that question.
Yeah.
I don't think they did.
It was
My
assumed
pastor,
that it was assumed that they could trust them. Yeah.
that's right. I mean, the ministers in our town, I played golf with a couple of them as a kid. Uh, whether they were Methodists or Episcopalians or Catholics, um, there was a there was just an institutional respect for the kinds of work that these people did, and they were respectable Christian leaders. And today, I believe that, let's just say 90%, I don't know the number of pastors are respectable.
Mhm.
But the number who aren't have ruined it for those who are.
Have 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 we become people of less integrity, or are are there just more ways to discover the lack of integrity than there used to be?
Um, I don't know the answer to that, but I suspect that there's a lot of truth in the second one, is that because of social media, because of the publicity skills that we have, whether good or bad, that everybody's bad story makes waves. Good stories don't get out there.
Mhm.
Um, but I know, I've traveled all around the United States and the world, and I've met so many wonderful
Oh
pastors.
yeah, me
And
too.
now I've met some charlatans, and that, I find out months later that they were having an affair at the time. They were talking to me about integrity.
Mhm.
But by and large, I've taught these students, these pastor students. Uh, I, I think there's a lot of goodness in the leadership skills of pastors in the
Yeah,
United States.
yeah, I agree. And I think to the extent that uh, social media and other things are allowing these things to come to light, I think that's the difficult but good news in the middle of this is that we can't. It's harder to cover our sins, and they should not be coverable. They should be exposed. Are there people who are exploiting that? Are the people who are manipulating it? Sure, absolutely. But these things need to be brought to light. I think we've got a wild west online in which there are all kinds of, witch hunters and everything else trying to find and expose people who haven't done anything wrong. And so there's that whole mix in there. But to the extent that evil deeds are being exposed to the light where there wasn't an opportunity to expose them anymore, I think that's a big part of why we need to pay attention. And I think if I'm misstating it, correct me. I think that's a big part of what your book Invisible Jesus is about. Here's why we need to pay attention to the deconstructors. They are shining a light on some of our problems that we should have fixed in-house. And that
Yep.
if they can point it out
Yep.
so that we can fix it in-house, they are doing us a favor. They're not harming
Yeah.
us, they're helping us.
We 100%. Tommy and I have said, the original title for the book was the prophetic voice of deconstruction, and the
Hmm.
editor said, "Oh, that's not going to be a title. We can't use that as a." I thought, well, prophecy and deconstruction, that's the kind of tension that gets people vibrating. But we believe that many of these deconstructors are exactly what you said, shining a light on some dark places that need to be exposed. And we have a lot, we can be grateful for this. And this is what Tommy and I have been in conversation with so many of these people that we just look at it and we think, I like you. I like you, deconstructor. You're doing us a real favor. And yeah, your
Yeah.
church is a mess. And a lot of churches have a little bit of problems. But um, your courage, your willingness to speak up and speak out is going to help in the long run.
There we go.
So
Well,
there's a reckoning going on.
The prophetic voice of deconstruction. Your editor may not have allowed it, but I've just decided I'm going to title this podcast that. So there we go. All right, I want to move now to something a little more controversial, not that all of this isn't already that, but what would you say to folks like me who hold a very right of center theology and political viewpoint, who might be concerned through reading your book that this is just a ploy to pull people over to leftist causes? Because the motion of deconstruction that you describe in your book tends to go from fundamentalist to less fundamentalist, and it's very easy to interpret that in the current political zeitgeist as moving from right to left. Have you found deconstructors who move from left to right, or is that entirely the direction? And if so, what's behind that?
Karl, this is a good question, and I don't think Tommy and I have talked about this, so I'm speaking for myself here.
All right.
I do think that this is a movement away from certain kinds of fundamentalism, whether it's a rigid view of Scripture, whether it's a harsh view of hell, whether it's a lack of interest in social justice. It's a moving away from those things toward a more open viewpoint. Okay, so if someone says that this book leads toward a little bit toward progressive evangelicalism, I would say yes, probably does. Is it progressive? I guess in some ways, in other ways it's not. We have a pretty strong view of Scripture. So I would say, yes, this is a book that is concerned with fundamentalist rigidities that deserve to be criticized. And Karl, I grew up in fundamentalism, and I would say of all the people in the church that I grew up with, it was a church of about 500. I knew one man who was a rigid fundamentalist. Now, there were some old-fashioned people who had some old ideas, but I did not grow up with mean-spirited fundamentalists. I grew up with kind-hearted fundamentalists who never wanted to talk about politics. And when a man in our church, a deacon, we're Baptists, ran for mayor, there were people in the church who didn't think that was right, that anybody should be involved that much in politics. Okay, right. So that's the kind of world I grew up in. So, but we've moved, we trace the deconstructors who've moved away from things like Christian nationalism, who have seen leaders in their church totally be intoxicated by the Republican Party, and it doesn't matter what the Republican Party decides, they're voting for it, versus the younger generation, which is increasingly moving a little bit toward the Democrats, that they're finding people who are willing to protect their own reputation at the expense of their own integrity, and they do so from rigid viewpoints of who they think they are and who they want the world to think they are, who they want the church to think they are. But if you say, is this a bit of a left push? I would say I think it is. I think that's where a lot of these deconstructors are going.
Okay. What's the reason behind that? Is because they're primarily coming from conservative, or because I see deconstruction coming on the left as well. I've spent a lot of time with friends in the United Methodist Church, for instance, who are walking away from an extreme leftist position politically and theologically there, morally, sexually, and everything else. And they wouldn't use the term deconstruction.
No.
But I think what they're doing is the same process, but in a different theological and political direction.
I think you're right. And it wouldn't be called deconstruction by those people, because it's sort of a revival, a recovery of the early Christian traditions as acceptable. And I know people in the Methodist Church too who've done this, and people in the Presbyterian Church who've done this. So the deconstructors tend to be people who use this term for themselves, who are moving in a little bit more open direction. But I want to emphasize that these aren't people moving to open theology. They're not moving to atheism that we discovered. They are moving to a church that they think has a more balanced, centered Jesus approach. I do not like that in the American politicization of the church, people who care for the poor are equated with Democrats, and people who care for the economy are called Republicans. I do not like that. I think Christians should embrace what is good and what is truthful, regardless of the party. But we are so politicized in the United States that if you say that you care for the borders and for immigrants, that people say you're a Democrat. I mean, I've had people say this to me, and I've had people on the left think I'm a fundamentalist because I'm against abortion.
Right.
So I think I wish Christians could carve out, evangelical Christians could carve out a political orientation without ever calling it that, because they've learned to speak to the issues of morality and human character.
Yeah. Yeah. One of the ways you very helpfully to me describe the difference here is you describe the difference between what you call bounded set and centered set thinking.
Yeah.
I think that would be helpful for our listeners. Can you walk through what that is? Because that to me is a great way of hanging on to what we're talking about here.
This goes back for me to a man named Paul Hebert, way back in a former two stages of my life ago, when I was teaching at Trinity Evangelical Divinity School. And my colleague, Paul Hebert, was in missiology, but he was a cultural anthropologist. And he taught us about bounded set and centered set. A bounded set tends to focus on who's in and who's out. What are the edges that are dangerous, and we stay away from those. A lot of evangelicalism is a bit obsessed with the boundaries. The centered set focuses on what is the core of our faith, what C.S. Lewis called mere Christianity.
Right.
And that as the farther you get from the center, let's say the center is Jesus Christ, the gospel, salvation in Christ, the Holy Spirit, a life in the church, fellowship with one another, these sort of basic Christian ideas. And then the farther you get from that they're not as important. It's not important what political persuasion you take. I tell my students all the time, I say, look, almost all of Europe are social democrats, and the United States, anybody who's a social democrat, for some people, is going to be called a communist.
Yeah.
And it's just not the truth. We need to respect the politics of other countries and recognize that Christians are in all political persuasion. These things are not the center of what we believe. The 7-year tribulation is not at the center. If it is at the center, it's a distortion of what's at the center. Jesus is in the center. And so Tommy got kind of, he wrote the original version of the centered set, bounded set. I taught about that. I learned about that 30 years ago. And occasionally I make use of it, and sometimes I don't. It's not as central to the way I talk about stuff, but I really like it. And Tommy and his church they're forming a centered set approach. And I really agree with this. And I think a lot of the deconstructors are looking at what are the elements they're going to drop inside that circle in the center, and say, these are the things that matter most.
Yeah, I agree. I'm currently working on my next book, which has the working title, The Priority Wheel. And it's actually based around an actual physical circular wheel where I have Jesus literally physically at the center of the wheel. And then the less important things as you go out, and how everything has to refocus back on Jesus in the center. And just so you know, just like I quoted you in De-sizing, I'll be quoting you in this book coming out. But I think this to me is the essence of it all. Anybody who's trying with any sincerity to reestablish that Jesus is at the center and that the event of the resurrection is what we cling to above all things. I'm with you on that journey, even if we disagree on some of the ways that you get there and some of the traditions that you might have. And most of the time I don't disagree. It just simply, you have your traditions that help you center on Jesus, and those ones don't help me center on Jesus. These church traditions here help me center on him
Yeah.
even better. I want to, as we bring this in for a landing, I want to take some time. We're going to do some bonus material separate from this. You walk through 3 stages of deconstruction in the book that I think are really important for pastors and church leaders to understand what people are walking through, that they can help them anticipate it. Part of the reason I want to talk about deconstruction so much is because when people are deconstructing, I want to be in the conversation with them.
Good.
I don't want if we simply make fun of the deconstructors, if we just simply say, I'm going to call it backsliding, if we say all you're doing is moving into the left or whatever, we then remove ourselves from the conversation. And then the only people in that conversation with them are going to be people who will want to pull them into a non-Christian direction. I want to be in the conversation because as you've shown, so many of them are really looking to find Jesus. And if they can speak to me and help me find Jesus more clearly, as I maybe help them find Jesus again, then everybody wins. But so we're going to do that. We're going to get to the lightning round. But before that, I want to go to page 210. Open, because it's right near the end of your book. And I've actually screenshot page 210 because this is one of those times where the page divisions worked out perfectly. People could literally frame page 210, and I've got these 3 pieces highlighted. It's the first sentence, a middle sentence, and the end sentence. And I'm just going to read those 3 sentences, beginning, middle, and end of page 210, because it's extraordinary, even how it fell on the page. So here's how it starts. Those who knew Jesus best said his eyes rested on the crowds before him. Matthew wrote, when he saw the crowds, he had compassion on them because they were harassed and helpless like sheep without a shepherd. Matthew 9:36. 2/3 of the way down the page, the masses of deconstructing Christians today are under the resting eye of Jesus. Beautiful writing, by the way, Scott. Thank you for that. And then the last sentence of this same page, we need shepherds whose eyes are fixed on Jesus and rest on his sheep. That page is a piece of art.
Well, thank you.
With those 3, so let's before we get to the lightning round, let's talk about that. Jesus, when he saw the crowds, he had compassion, and the deconstructing Christians are under the resting eye of Jesus, and we need to help them by being people who fix our eyes on Jesus and rest on his sheep. That's just so beautifully phrased.
Well, this is an amazing description at the end of Matthew chapter 9, where Jesus saw the crowds and they were harassed and flayed. And the language is of they were abused. This is from Ezekiel. They were abused by false shepherds, bad shepherds. But Jesus saw them and he cared for them and they flocked to him. And that's when Jesus sends out the 12 the first time. So the mission is a response to Jesus's compassion on all people. And his eye is on these people. And this is one of the things that has really struck me about Tommy in working with him on this book. He was a student for 4 years with me, but working with him on a book really put us in touch with one another. He has an instinctive gift at seeing people that other people ignore. He sees them and says, there's something going on there that I can touch. And we need shepherds like this who, because their eyes are on Jesus, that their eyes begin to adjust to seeing things the way Jesus saw things. And then they see these people who are harassed and flayed in all sorts of ways, abused, and they have a heart for these people. You know, it's really sad. My wife posted something today on Twitter about this. She brought it down to show me. Is when a lot of leaders, when they hear someone tell a story of, let's just say, in generalized abuse of some sort, they dismiss it. Oh, that happened years ago. That wasn't a big issue.
Yeah.
Well, my wife is a psychologist, and she says, no, the first instinct is we need to listen to these people.
Yeah.
We need to see these people. True pastoring is to see people where they are and not coerce them to be where you are, where we are. And when we do that, we've got the eyes of Jesus.
Yeah, absolutely. Beautiful. Well, we'll go to the lightning round. As a reminder, we are going to do the bonus material on the 3 stages of deconstruction. So if you're interested in the bonus material, go to karlvaters.com/support to become a regular financial partner, and you will get the weekly newsletter with the links to all of the bonus material, or you can get it for free by going to karlvaters.com/subscribe. Either way, you will get the weekly newsletter every Friday. You'll have all the links to all the bonus material from all of these podcasts, including the bonus material on the 3 stages of deconstruction that I'll go through with Scott. But before we let you go from the main podcast here, let's go through the lightning round. You didn't do it the last time because it was a special episode, but you got to go through it this time. All right. Lightning round question number 1. What are the biggest changes you've seen in your field of ministry in the last few years, and how have you adapted to them?
The growth of diverse voices in biblical studies, both women and people of color.
Interesting.
And I read them and I see them.
And what does that bring? What is the benefit of that for all of us?
Well, all right. I just finished reading Ephesians and Colossians in the New Testament in color, edited. One of the editors, Esau McCauley, at Wheaton. And Esau wrote Ephesians, Dennis Edwards, both of them are African American. He wrote on Colossians, and they see things in that text that I don't see because they come from their world and it's not my world.
Yeah.
So,
yeah, very nice. Second, what free resource like an app or website has helped you lately that you would recommend for small church ministry?
There is a wonderful Bible study resource, and I don't use a lot of these, but his name is Nick Crowley, Crawley. He lives in England, in Bristol, England. He has a wonderful page. It's like fresh Bible studies every day, and he just spends his life working on this page. It's a wonderful resource.
Oh, great. Yeah, we'll put links to that in the show notes. That sounds great. Third, what's the best piece of ministry advice you've ever received?
I would say pastoral ministry begins with prayer and leads to Bible study on a regular basis, not for the purpose of sermons or teaching or academic work, but to listen to God.
Wonderful.
Maybe the second one would be, you've got to be connected to a sage, someone who is older and wiser with gray hair who can guide you.
Yeah. Even an understanding of story theory tells you that.
Yeah.
Yeah. You got to have the guide come along. Finally, what's the funniest or weirdest thing you've ever seen in church?
That I've seen. Now, I know one time a friend told me that they were having a baptism and they had a bathtub, and the person fell in the bathtub and water was sloshing all over. And the lady stands up and says, I didn't want to get baptized anyway. So, that was pretty funny. That's one of the funniest things I've ever heard about churches.
Wow. Yeah, the first baptism I didn't realize I needed to have the person walk towards the front of the baptistry, and I dipped them from the middle and their head hit the wall.
Ooh.
Yeah, that was my first ever baptism. Everybody else after that, oh yeah, walk all the way up to this end, and then because it's only person length. And if you start in the middle, there's not enough space to dip the entire person in.
Yeah.
So Scott, thank you so much for this. I
Yep.
really encourage people to get a hold of the book, Invisible Jesus, a book about leaving the church and looking for Christ. We're going to go into the bonus material. So if you would like that one more time, go to karlvaters.com/support or karlvaters.com/subscribe. You'll get the links to all the bonus material. Thank you so much for your time today, Scott.
Thank you.